Our doors opened in 1874 with a simple goal: to educate students. But there's always been more to it than that. When the world battled its neighbors, McAllister raised the United Nations flag. When others said no, McAllister said yes. When division and discrimination plagued this country, McAllister alumni and students organized and took action.
We are not complacent.
We are not apathetic.
You, out there, have made a difference. In your neighborhood, in your town, in your city, and beyond. So, for all the learners, for all the mentors, for all of us everywhere asking big questions, thank you.
Thank you for not just asking why, but also what's next. Thank you for launching our mission into the world. Thank you for continuing to support that mission. Every day, for every student, whose aim is to lift up, to change, to discover, to reimagine.
To make this a place where we all belong.
A place where education is just the beginning.
It is our practice to begin our programs with a land acknowledgement. We would like to take a moment to honor the fact that McAllister is on Dakota land, and many of us currently occupy the ancestral homelands of the Native peoples who were forcibly exiled from the land because of aggressive and persistent settler colonialism. We make this acknowledgement to honor the peoples of the First Nations, their ancestors and descendants, as well as the land itself. We recognize that this acknowledgement itself is not enough and only serves as a first step towards decolonization.
Dayatu Washte, Kayla Amachiapi. Hello, and welcome to this evening's Big Question program. I am Kayla Richards, class of 2010, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. And I'm currently coming to you from my bedroom, a sign of COVID times, from the city of Minneapolis, arguably one of the epicenters of a number of contemporary discussions surrounding human rights in the United States. As a clinical social worker working within the juvenile justice, acute mental health, and higher education institutions, I often find myself holding questions and struggling around this very topic. As a registered member of the Oglala Lakota Nation, I'm also personally interested in this evening's big question. Before we jump into introductions and get started with virtual technical etiquette, I'd like to offer all of us at home a virtual smudge. I actually just set my fire alarm off with the smudge. I want us all to take a minute and take a deep breath in and offer all of us at home an extension of traditional medicine used to prepare people for ceremony and teachings. I know that the medicine will reach everywhere it needs to go this evening, and it will help us all tune in to curiosity and one another. My only regret is that we are not together in person. As we move through this evening's conversation, if you have questions or technical difficulties, you can chat MAC help staff directly from the platform, or using your mobile phone, text the phone number 651-204-3910 for assistance to contact our tech support team directly. We have allocated plenty of time this evening, both for questions you might have shared during registration, as well as live questions, things that come up this evening and resonate with you. Please use your Q&A box. I will be sharing your question and who is asking the question. So if you could share your name and pronunciation and pronouns, I would appreciate it. Names are important. In addition, we will move to another Zoom after the program for continued conversation. We hope you will join us there. Watch the chat for the link. Throughout the years, McAllister has addressed big and difficult questions. We started our Big Question series as a way to dive into critical issues in a way that connects alum, parents with one another, to faculty, and to the work of the college. This year, we are thrilled to have McAllister President Suzanne Rivera leading the Big Questions conversations. As we continue to welcome her to McAllister, we appreciate her leadership. especially now as we navigate everything happening in the world around us. So she is excited to be with all of you online until we can meet again in person. So tonight, we're coming together to discuss the big question, what happened to human rights? The United States has a paradoxical relationship with the modern human rights movement. The question itself feels paradoxical. On the one hand, the US positions itself as a progenitor and champion. On the other, it's an international outlier that has refused to ratify key international treaties. And a country that's often quick to identify atrocities abroad and slow to acknowledge patterns of violence at home. What's the history and future of human rights in the US? These are critical and difficult issues, and we are fortunate that President Rivera will bring her bioethicist lens to the discussion as our host this evening. Joining her in conversation are Macallister's James Dawes, DeWitt Wallace Professor of English and Human Rights and Humanitarianism Concentration faculty member, and Rachel Rostad, class of 2015, who currently studies international affairs and human rights with a background in research and work exploring obstacles to the social, legal, and economic inclusion of refugees in the Asia-Pacific region. I also wanted to note that Rachel is a published essayist and poet. This will surely be a great conversation. President Rivera, I will now turn the program over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Kayla. I want to mention while she's with us here now that Kayla is our 2020 Catherine Lealtad Service to Society Award recipient. The Catherine Lealtad Service to Society Award is given to alumni of color who've used their education to distinguish themselves in service to the community. We thank you, Kayla, for your work to reduce inequalities in the judicial system. It's really important. Thanks for what you do. Welcome, everyone. It is so great to be with all of you today. I am really looking forward to my conversation with Professor Dawes and Rachel Rostad, class of 2015. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special thank you to a standout alumna volunteer who's joining us tonight, Jana Hong from the class of 2017. Jana is a Macallister Fund class agent whose outreach during the Give from the Heart campaign this past December generated the most participation of all our volunteer advocates. She recently shared her Macallister story at the How Does Religion Influence Politics Big Questions event too. Thank you for all the great work you do for MAC, Jana. We appreciate you. I also want to acknowledge that March is Women's History Month. This is a time when we commemorate, honor, and celebrate the vital role of women in society. So in a moment, we will turn to our panelists to help us dig into the topic of human rights. But first, I want to kind of set the table a little by acknowledging the moment we're in right now. The trial of former police officer Derek Chauvin for the killing of George Floyd is underway in Minnesota. Many of us are watching the debate about how to best help unescorted children at the border. There are deep disparities in how the COVID virus is affecting different communities, and we still lack a coherent, equitable national strategy for vaccine distribution. There's been an increase in violence against Asians, Asian Americans, and Pacific Islanders over the last year. And this last week brought us 2 horrific acts of mass gun violence, raising again questions about how the freedom to own firearms is in tension with the freedom to feel safe going to the grocery store. Arguably, all these current challenges touch upon or are influenced by the way we think about and enforce so-called human rights in the United States. So what we're going to talk about tonight is, what are human rights? Do they include freedom from police brutality? Do they include access to health care? How do we value human rights? Do we value them as much as we value individual autonomy? These questions will be at the center of our spirited conversation tonight. So let's begin. I'm going to start with you, Professor Dawes. I'd like you to just begin by defining for us the phrase human rights.
First, let me thank you for having me here. I'm delighted to be in the conversation and super excited to be out of the house.
Me too.
So the definition of human rights is both simple and inoffensive, but in practice, it's become extremely complex and controversial. Excuse me. Human rights are just those rights we have by virtue of being human, so not because of our religion, race, or nationality, just the basic dignities of being a person. Entailed in this notion of human rights is the idea that they trump state sovereignty. And this is where it gets tricky. So before the invention of human rights, essentially, it was understood that all governments could decide to do what they wanted with their citizens. You might have a concern with how people in country X are being treated, but it wasn't your business. You had no say. With human rights, this changes. Now, governments, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and even individual citizens get to have a say in the affairs of other countries. And so this is why the US, as the introduction says, has had such a paradoxical life with human rights. On the one hand, it has been a major leader. Eleanor Roosevelt was the chair of the drafting committee for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and key organizations like Human Rights Watch originated in US activism. On the other hand, the US is a key violator abroad and at home, and it refuses to ratify treaties, as was mentioned, even treaties like the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And this is in large part because the US does not like signing documents that cede authority to anyone else. And they don't like signing documents that tell their own citizens that they can appeal to authorities outside of the US government for moral persuasion.
Great. Well, that is a broad definition, and now I'd like to get Rachel into the conversation. Do you agree with this definition? You think anything is missing from that definition?
Yeah, that was a great summary of what human rights are more in terms of how it relates to law and governance. And I wanted to add more of a, I guess, subjective or personal part of human rights, which I think to me means belonging. And it's something I've thought about a lot because I was adopted from South Korea when I was a baby. And I grew up in a town of about 10,000 in central Minnesota. And it was over 95% white. And as you could imagine, I struggled a lot with feeling like I fit in. And the people around me showed in many ways, in small ways, even my closest friends, that they didn't think that I was really one of them. And of course, I had a very unpleasant homecoming to this feeling over the course of the last year with the advent of the pandemic and our former president calling COVID the China virus, Kung flu, and the rise of anti-Asian sentiment. And I remember I was living in Boston at the time, and I remember walking around, and one time someone shouted at me from their car, another time I was carrying my groceries home, and a man passed me on the street and started screaming at me from a foot away. And I don't remember what he said, but I remember the look on his face because I've seen it many times before. And I remember the sickening feeling of seeing myself through their eyes as a caricature of myself, as less than, and knowing that to this person, I do not, and I will never belong here. And why is that? Why was it so easy for Trump to turn COVID into a punchline by using the phrase Kung flu? Why are Asian Americans seen as perpetual outsiders here? My friend posted the other day these terrible cartoons from the 1800s that are this racist depiction of the evil, sinister Chinaman coming to California to steal away jobs from white people. And you could draw a line from that all the way to the pandemic related xenophobia today. And I could show you countless depictions of Asian women throughout the years as fetishized, sexualized objects. And that, of course, culminated last week in the shooting of 6 Asian women by a white man because they were a sexual temptation. And this dehumanization is not just at the interpersonal or cultural level. It goes hand in hand with American law and policy. Those cartoons go hand in hand with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and the violent objectification of Asian women was entrenched in American culture because of America's military involvement in Asia. So it's clear that interpersonal or cultural dehumanization and institutional dehumanization is a vicious circle. Because when you don't think that people are one of us, when you don't think they belong, you're not going to protest if they don't have the same rights as you. You're not, at best, you're going to be indifferent, and at worst, you're going to support discriminatory laws and policies. And on the other side of the equation, governments exploit that in-group, out-group mentality to scapegoat the out-group in order to bolster support. So if dehumanization, when it's institutionalized, that's a human rights abuse. And then maybe accordingly, belonging at the institutional level is what human rights means. Because when governments acknowledge the right of all people to migrate without discrimination, the right of people to not be killed in state-sanctioned violence, the right to resources, including material reparations for the harms of enslavement and colonization, that's an acknowledgement that all people belong to a common humanity. And I always think about that feeling I described earlier when someone calls me a racist slur, and all of the value and dignity and complexities I have as a person are shrunk down and flattened into the one dimension of an ugly word. I think the opposite of that feeling is belonging, and that's what human rights means to me.
Wow, well, I'm going to stick with you because I want to press further on this point. Some folks would characterize the kind of use of racist epithets or bigotry or prejudice that you're describing using the phrase civil rights. So I just want to tease this apart a little bit here. Do you think there's a difference between human rights and civil rights, or are they the same thing?
Well, I think in theory and in practice, it's very different because of what Jim described earlier, how the international human rights regime is seen as kind of this external force that's telling Americans or the American government what it should and should not do. And so I think on that level, they're separated in terms of how at least the government treats them. And I know we'll be talking about that tonight. But I think what I was getting at, and I intentionally am talking about belonging and kind of this idea of human rights that doesn't, that goes to maybe the spirit of it, the spirit behind human rights, the feeling of injustice when we see something that is oppressing another person. And so I think that's maybe the center of the Venn diagram. Mm. And the problem is that that American policy so often does not treat civil rights like a human rights issue.
Thank you. Professor Dawes, I'd also like to put human rights in historical context a little bit. Can you explain for our audience a little bit about the history of the term human rights?
Sure. So roughly speaking, we tend to think of human rights as coming in 3 generations. So it begins in the 18th century with the Enlightenment, and there it focuses on civil liberties, the rights of political participation, and protection from excessive state power. We tend to think of this as freedom from. So the state can't detain you indefinitely or without cause. You can't be tortured. You're free from those worries. The second generation of rights arises in the early 20th century with the rise of organized labor. And these are economic and social rights. So these focus less on what the government must refrain from doing to you and more on what the government must do for you. If you are experiencing food insecurity, housing insecurity, if you lack healthcare or educational opportunities, this is a form of deep coercion, no differently from state coercion. And so we have rights to education, we have rights to healthcare, we have rights to housing. The third generation of rights begins with the decolonization of Asia and Africa after World War II, and these are what we call collective rights. So the first 2 generations focus on individuals, the third generation is what groups need to flourish. And it begins with the idea that colonialism is a grave human rights violation, and that therefore we need to focus on the right of national solidarity and of cultural and political self-determination. And so those are the big pictures of the rights.
That's really helpful. So if we've been talking about the experience in the US, but this is really a global issue. So do you think the term human rights resonates differently around the world? And do you think it resonates differently between communities within the United States?
Well, just to build off your second question to Rachel, it really resonates differently in the US, for sure. And this is because of its sort of deeply tragic history of how civil rights and human rights sort of ruptured. So in 1947, W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP brought a petition to the newly created United Nations Commission on Human Rights. And this petition was called An Appeal to the World. It was a request that the UN look into systematic violation of the rights of African Americans. Eleanor Roosevelt, who, as was mentioned before, was very important at the UN, she was also on the board of directors for the NAACP, and she was outraged. And she said she would resign unless they withdrew this application. And she gave two reasons. First, that this was just going to play into the hands of Soviet propaganda. And second, that the rights of people of color in the US, she didn't use that language, but the rights of people of color in the US did not count as human rights. And so the NAACP backed down, and they promised never again to go to the UN for help.
Wow.
And the quite clear lesson here for African Americans was that the human rights movement, this shiny new movement, was going to leave them out. It was going to be of no help to them. And so for the longest time, what human rights meant in America and what civil rights meant in America were separated. This, in fact, got reinforced over the decades by legal scholars who argued that civil rights was different because it invoked the concept of the citizen, and that triggered constitutional protections. It did not invoke the concept of the human, which would trigger human rights protections. This had two very pernicious effects, which we're still dealing with today. First, it reinforced this notion of American exceptionalism, that human rights violations are things that happen elsewhere, that somehow we are above all of that. And second, it depicted violations against African Americans in particular as sort of things to be addressed with tweaks to the otherwise perfectly just, transparent, and smoothly operating judicial and policing system, rather than kind of acknowledging the baked-in white supremacy of the system that required more fundamental change.
Thank you. Rachel, I'm going to come back to you. You heard Professor Dawes talking about the difference between thinking about rights with regard to freedom from things like abuse or hunger or violence versus the idea of freedom to, like freedom to express your beliefs or freedom to make choices, freedom to exercise autonomy. Would you say in the US that we emphasize now, today, more of a freedom from or a freedom to approach to thinking about human rights?
I think that in my view, and kind of seeing the shifts of the last year from the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement, and kind of this growing awareness, what we all owe to each other, and what the government owes in terms of resources to people is really, I think, shifting, but it's hard to say if that's the general public. But I do think that there's a growing awareness across political lines that we all deserve decent work. We all deserve to be able to eat. We deserve to have housing. And I think that is a shift from what I've seen from before, where and I also thinking of gun violence, like we were talking about at the beginning. I think that's a very great example of how the conversations are shifting.
Well, I'll take the host prerogative here to chime in too and say that I think our struggle to address the pandemic as a public health emergency in a coherent way should be amplifying conversations about whether healthcare is a human right, or whether it should be a national right in the US and whether it is a human right. And I'm waiting for that conversation to mature because it seems like a natural direction for us to head in as we struggle with figuring out how to get vaccines into people's arms. And for those of you who are not here in Minnesota, we just got an announcement that starting on March 30th, anyone over 16 can get the vaccine here, which is, as Dr. Fauci says, the light at the end of the tunnel is getting brighter. It's a nice piece of encouraging news, but I don't think we can lose sight of this broader question about whether healthcare is a human right and ought to be a right in the United States. I'm going to go back to Professor Dawes here. Americans are often slow to call racism and police violence and mass incarceration here at home human rights abuses, even if we might label the same exact behavior in another country as a human rights abuse. Can you talk about why you think that is?
I think it comes down to a previously fairly firm faith in sort of American political culture that the democratic systems in operation in the US were optimal, and that we did not need recourse to other corrective systems. I think when the lessons that's been learned, it's a lesson that many people knew forever, But the lesson that sort of mainstream white America has come to see more recently is these optimal systems were never optimal. These optimal systems always needed redress and correction from abroad, and it was no different from other countries that they tended to treat with disdain.
So how do you think the new executive branch administration leadership could begin to tackle human rights domestically?
Well, so Rachel and I have talked about this before. It's sometimes a tricky question because there are circumstances in which invoking the human rights language and rhetoric can be really helpful. It can be motivating. It can help you form alliances across borders. And so you sometimes see this now in neighborhood activist groups even, where human rights is effective and useful. There are places, though, where using that language can be alienating, and it can be counterproductive to your purposes. That has a lot to do with how the Cold War sorted things out. So after World War II, the US shamed the Soviet Union for civil and political rights violations. The Soviet Union, in turn, shamed the US for economic and social rights violations. Mm-hmm. And so in the US, anything that was associated with economic equality, social equality, over time got slowly associated in the mind of political culture with communism and sort of a foreign threat. And so the US has become increasingly resistant to seeing these issues as things that we should attend to and prioritize.
Okay, well, I'm going to kick the same question over to you, Rachel, and ask if you were an advisor to the new executive branch administration leadership, what would you want them to start tackling domestically as a human rights issue?
Well, I think that's a big question, and I'll do my best to answer it. And I guess that is the name of the event. I think that there's a lot of disappointment in especially my generation in kind of the lukewarm treatment that the Democratic Party has had towards these more radical ideas about making sure that people basically have resources and that they don't need to be in this constant grind, and that that this myth of a land of opportunity is just that, a myth. And I think that it seems like this is a moment where maybe those conversations are finally gaining traction, but I think that the administration should listen to people and not just try to hit the middle ground. And I know that's a very controversial or possibly problematic thing to say, but I think they need to set the agenda instead of just taking an average. And I think we're looking for hope, at least speaking for my generation and many people I know in my generation, we're looking for hope and change and transformation. And I really hope that the administration transforms the way our society operates. It's a tall order, but
it is a tall order. But let's say, for the sake of argument, we were able to make strides with regard to human rights at home. What about the way we address human rights abuses in other countries? Do we need to change the way we think about and talk about and behave toward countries that we allege are creating human rights abuses?
So I tend to think of that as sort of two different things. So on the one hand, there's the public relations government approach to human rights abroad, mm-hmm. where there might be interventions or sanctions or political pressure applied. They're in fact a good thing, but they're not being done in fact for the purpose of promoting human rights. There's some political aims that are maybe a bit more nefarious behind them. Mm-hmm. And then there are these sort of the work being done by activists and organizations, which gets little to no attention, and where people sacrifice their health, wealth, and well-being to try to make a difference in places here and abroad that need help. So I think the world is fairly tired of some of the proclamations of human rights superiority coming from the US and the kind of interventionism that follows from that. And a bit more humility in that respect, I think, would serve this new administration well.
Okay, so one word that nobody has said here is hypocrisy or behaving in a hypocritical fashion. We heard paradox at the beginning of the introduction. So I'm wondering whether, is part of the problem that if we haven't cleaned things up in our own house, that we shouldn't be telling other people what to do in theirs? Or might there be a way in which, regardless of whatever is happening in the US, that countries still have a role to play in opining on what's happening in other countries?
Yeah, I think they do, and I think we have to keep in mind that there's no one government, and there's no one human rights movement in the U.S. Right? So there are incredibly dedicated civil servants, incredibly dedicated people in the government and organizations who are doing the good work of human rights for the right reasons, and there are others who are being hypocritical, and it's always going to be a mix. And for those of us who work in human rights, frankly, often we're a little less concerned about whether the motivations of governments are pure, as long as they're doing what we ask.
Okay, so I'm going to stick with this topic about human rights or abuses around the world, Rachel, and come to you for a second. Many of the ways the U.S. has exercised leadership in this regard has to do with things like sanctions and weak multilateral resolutions. How do we move past those kinds of political plays toward a more sort of impactful way to highlight abuses and rectify abuses around the world? Is there a role that the U.S. has to play as a leader in this regard?
I think it's very different depending on the specific human rights issue, because something like a government waging war on its own citizens is a very different question than if a government isn't providing social services to its people. And the latter is something that maybe USAID works on, those types of things. And I think that's less controversial than the other question that I think when people think intervention, they think military intervention. And I think that is increasingly unpopular in I guess from all audiences. I would argue that from the left, it's looked at as kind of what we're discussing, very hypocritical, and also an excuse to wage war for security interests and not for human rights at all. And then on the other hand, I think there's a growing broader awareness or sentiment that we don't want to be policing the world. We want to just take care of what's at home. And I think I don't know if there really is like a clear mechanism or resolution that would make America effective in advancing human rights. Because I think if you think about us as an actor, as the government as an actor, building on what Jim was saying, how there are these individuals within the system, but the United States as a government cannot escape its history of intervention and intervening for security concerns and under the auspices of human rights and harming other countries. And I think no matter what the intentions are or what the strategy is, I don't think it can be extricated from that. And I think I moved a bit away from your question there.
That's okay. I'm going to come back to you in a minute, but first I'm going to ask Professor Dawes, if you had a magic wand and you could rectify an egregious human rights abuse anywhere in the world, what would be the top priority for you?
I can tell you what my top priority would be now, which may be just idiosyncratic for the moment. But in the spirit of big questions and magic wands, I think we are going to get to a point where it's understood there needs to be universal basic income in this country. So much of the needless suffering in a country of such great wealth just simply has to be addressed. Basic dignities have to be guaranteed, and I think universal basic income would be the thing to do that.
Great, thank you. And Rachel, I'm going to ask you exactly the same question. If you had a magic wand and you could rectify an egregious human rights abuse anywhere in the world, what would be the top priority for you?
I think that we need to dismantle the policing system and criminal justice system. And I know that's maybe so obvious to many people in this audience that it's maybe a cop-out, but I think that's something that I think is extremely important, and there's growing momentum around it. And we've already seen some shift, and I hope that continues.
So you're talking about here in the US?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm just going to say I find it interesting that both of you, with an open-ended question about a magic wand, you could pick anything around the world. You both chose to address issues in the United States. I mean, I think there are plenty of human rights abuses happening all around the world at any given time, and it was an open-ended question, but I just find it interesting, and I hope in the further Q&A that we're going to have, we can illuminate some other kinds of abuses that also we might think are worthy of being addressed in the near future. And this is the point in our conversation, actually, where we have to start moving toward the Q&A portion of the evening. So even though I hate to wrap up this part of the conversation, because I know we could continue talking about this, we want to make sure that we leave lots of time for the audience's questions. So first, let me just say thank you, Professor Dawes, and thank you, Rachel Rostad. Your perspectives have brought new insights to a topic I know we're all thinking about deeply. But we also want to answer the questions of all the people who have joined us online tonight. We've been tracking questions as they've been coming in. And actually, all of you who are tuned in are invited to continue adding questions using the Q&A tab. So now what we'd like to do is welcome back Kayla Richards from Mac's class of 2010 to moderate the Q&A portion of the evening. And as a reminder for those who didn't log in right at the very beginning, Kayla is a Hennepin County Juvenile Probation Supervisor. She's also an assessment and referral clinician at Allina Health and adjunct faculty member at the University of St. Thomas's School of Social Work. She's also a member of the Oglala Lakota tribe and an accomplished social worker dedicated to identifying trauma, inequity, and bias, and working hard to rectify injustices. So I actually hope that Kayla will not merely be a moderator tonight, but also will bring her own perspectives to the conversation. Kayla, are you ready to join us?
Yes, thank you so much, President Rivera. And thank you all for that really nice opening for this evening's conversation. I was sitting here listening and wanting to interject. And one of the things that I heard throughout as sort of a theme is the sense of duality, and so I think that the idea of it being a big question makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of really thoughtful questions coming in, and I wanted to come back to something that Rachel had mentioned in terms of advancing human rights, particularly as we think about something that President Rivera mentioned earlier in relationship to COVID. And so this question comes from Eric Etjen, class of 1982, he, him pronouns. And what important ways have the challenges faced when working to advancing human rights changed due to COVID and the increasingly polarized political rhetoric?
Who wants to take that one? Do you want to begin?
So shortly after Trump was elected, I was working with a sort of semi-national group of people doing different kinds of activism and research in human rights. And we knew this was going to be a uniquely challenging time, specifically for human rights. And so one of the strategies that needed to be taken up, and this is generally the kind of thing we wouldn't say out loud in public, is that we would continue doing the work, but we wouldn't use the language of human rights, because the country had turned, at least in its kind of major political figures, so hard right, so sort of far right, this would be counterproductive. And so we had to find ways to continue promoting this work, continue building foundations and connections and networks without triggering the kind of reactive ire that would be so counterproductive and it has been so counterproductive over the past 4 years. So that's one of the changes, it's temporary, that had to be taken. I think it's temporary because one of the reasons you see the kind of anti-global, anti-human rights reaction of the Trump administration was precisely because it had become so pervasive and so successful. It's a sort of a dying reaction that was out of fear, and we will move past it.
Rachel, do you have anything that you want to add about that, especially around COVID?
Yeah, and I think there's been a lot of discussion about the decline of democracy over the last several years, but I think especially with the pandemic. So I do think that's an element of, there's more conversations about how authoritarian governments are using the pandemic to close down borders, to further marginalize people that are already marginalized. And so I think the impact of COVID has also cut that way.
And it's also sort of revealed how in-place discriminations and inequalities exacerbate vulnerability so terribly, and that you can't just sort of continue the same old way without like a serious death toll.
Yep.
Yeah, and adding on to that, I think just on like a consciousness level, I do think the pandemic has really allowed people to break out of kind of this inertia or indifference to the suffering of people around them in their own communities, because this pandemic has so fundamentally transformed the way we see ourselves within communities and see the people around us. And so I think that gives me hope that I think, as Jim is saying, it points out that these new difficulties are the same difficulties we've already been having. And now we're finally, for those of us with privilege to not see those before, I think it's become a lot more clear and disturbing, and something that people are working to fix now.
Thank you. Kayla, do you have another question for us?
Yeah, I was thinking, Rachel, while you were talking, and one of the things that resonated with me was, also this idea of how incredibly revealing the last year has felt because of the pandemic and the uprisings. And, coming to you from Minneapolis, it's happening in my backyard, literally. And it's a really interesting space to live in right now. And it really, I think for me anyway, has pushed up against what I hold as values and norms, because I'm living in a space where they play out. And so I was thinking about that, and there was a question that came in, through registration, that I think is relatable. So when people think about human rights violations, sometimes I think the argument is that there is a culturally relevant sort of, explanation for that violation. And so therefore it's not a valid violation in the way that we might hold it. How do you hold cultural relativism and human rights violations? And the reason I'm thinking about that is in the context of community violence and community policing. I think that there are people who would say culturally relativism is applicable, and that when I work and do this job, there are behaviors and decisions that I make that are relevant to my work and therefore are not violating of another person's human rights, if that makes sense.
Well, what you made me think of just now is the way in which, in many cultures, the oppression of women is considered a social norm as opposed to a human rights abuse, which is one reason that people feel it needs to be said publicly that women's rights are human rights, and I think it translates to trans rights are human rights, and people of color's rights are human rights, and it shouldn't have to be said that people deserve to be treated like people, but given different cultural norms, it turns out we do need to say it. That's what your comment made me think of, Kayla. Professor Dawes, what's raised for you in her comments?
So I'm a little less troubled by cultural relativism, by the supposed problem of cultural relativism, because in practice what I've seen over the years is when people say, practice X, which you're criticizing as a human rights violation, is just part of our culture, and so you can't criticize it. What you see in those cases is actually in that culture, there are a lot of people in that culture criticizing it. Within that own political vocabulary and cultural vocabulary, there is resistance. So I think this notion is often used by abusive authorities of some kind to cover up the fact that their own people don't want it.
Yeah. Rachel, do you want to get in on this question?
Yeah, and I think adding to what Jim is saying, I think there's a big difference between, say, for America's government to decide that we need to go and solve that problem in another place, and you have people on one side saying that that it doesn't matter that it's cultural, because I mean we've seen this in many of America's much of America's involvement in the Middle East, and you have people saying we're doing it to protect women, which obviously is not the reason for the involvement. And so I think there's a very valid critique of that, but at the same time, as Jim is saying, if someone within that society is critiquing it, I think that's a very different dynamic than what we've been talking about tonight about Americans pointing fingers at other places.
This question comes from Scott Lowry, class of 1973, him, her. What are some of the ways the U.S. could own and own up to its history of genocide, slavery, and other systemic forms of oppression and marginalization of its own citizens? Why do you think efforts like these provoke such strong denial and pushback from Americans who profess love of country?
I think the question of how is very difficult, especially in terms of implementation, even aside from the political level. So I guess I'll address the part that's why is this so controversial? I was on TikTok the other night and this video came up. I don't know why it showed up. It shouldn't be in my algorithm, but it was a white man talking about how white people don't complain about slavery that's in their heritage or history because they don't care and they've moved on, and they're not going to like whine about the past. And obviously that's such a terrible view of it because it's not the same at all. And I think the pushback comes when people have this false equivalency, and they feel, I mean, there's a lot written about white victimization, and I think that's the element. It's like there's so many great tweets and memes, and I'm trying to think of like one that's particularly powerful. I think there was one that was like, if you think that if you think the idea of being treated, what was it? If you're scared by the idea of equality, that's proof in and of itself that you are the current winner in the system and the oppressor. And I think it's very hard for people to acknowledge their complicity. And I think even for people who care deeply, I think it's very difficult for people with privilege to really grapple with what that means in terms of how they need to be spending their resources and how they need to address their own what feels like accomplishments that they as an individual have done. How do you look at your life back and realize that it's because of all of these unequal structures? And so it's such a I think that's why it makes people so defensive, because it is very difficult for people to really internalize that and then also act on it.
Yeah. My sense is that people really struggle with, the idea that this is a system and it's structural. As a clinical social worker over the last year, I would say the people that I've been disappointed the most by are other social workers. Individuals who are professional and well-intentioned and want to, uplift communities that have been under-resourced. And I think that you're right, Rachel, that it feels as though this is something that racism lives in me. And so if I'm a good person, then that solves the problem without really thinking about some of the structural issues. I'm curious about ways people can get involved in the human rights discourse. Any recommended readings or particularly hopeful figures, platforms to consider? How can we work against human rights abuses in our own communities?
I don't want to talk too much, but I would say find the organizers in your communities. That's something that I have realized over the last year because I was very ignorant about community organizing, always adjacent and appreciative, but I didn't really realize that that's where it all starts. And it's the local level that you're really going to understand the context the best. You're going to be able to to do it in a way where you're not just an outsider coming in. And I think going back to the broader question of America and human rights on the individual level, I think there's that critique of Americans that want to work in human rights, is that it's on an individual level, not on government policy level. It's easier to go somewhere else and think that you can fix something. There's this amazing essay by, I think her name is Courtney Martin, about the reductive seduction of other people's problems. And I recommend everyone read it. And I think finding your community organizer or organizers in your own place is the antidote to that type of thinking, and how you can really get involved with human rights. Because human rights movements have always happened. They might not be incorporated into this international system that with organizations that are headquartered in New York and Geneva. And that's exactly the problem with a lot of the international human rights institutions. And so I think if you want to work in human rights or for human rights, find your community organizers.
Would you add anything about something to read or something to watch or something to listen to?
I think it can be very personal. When I was Rachel's age, I read a book called The Body and Pain, which was about torture and the way torture functions. And for me, it was sort of life-changing. It spoke to personal experiences of people in my extended family, and it inspired me to want to look for, in this case, maybe to fill out Rachel's answer, finding the community leaders is absolutely the best start. An easier start, which is what I took, was looking for the big organizations. So groups like Human Rights Watch or humanitarian groups like Doctors Without Borders, they have very easy entry points into becoming educated on their issues and to becoming supporters of their causes, and that can also be a way to do this.
Great. So find something that feels accessible and relevant maybe to your own experience. I love that. I think that's really good advice. I'm looking, I think there's time for me to pull one more question before we come back. Is it worth it to work to make the US a more effective member of organizations like the UN through ratifying rights of the child, joining the ICC, et cetera? Or should we be looking for different solutions, so outside of a community or local context? And that question comes from Chloe Moore, class of 2024.
So I think it's worth it. I know part of what was implicit in one of your questions earlier was that it can feel like an endless slog, all of these treaties and all of these sanctions, and it seems like it's not making a difference. But I'm actually a big believer in those institutions and the work they do. And the reason I feel like it's endless is not because it's ineffective, but because the struggle of justice against power is endless. And often it's not about achieving some highly visible public good that's a win. It's about minimizing something that's truly horrific and being very deliberately hidden. Mm-hmm. And that can be less rewarding, but it's deeply important.
Kayla, what's your answer to that question? Do you see working through the existing structures as the way to go, or do you see that we need to break out and try things that go outside of the existing paradigms?
Oh, that's such a good question. That's such a big question, right? As like an interventionist, so I come from a very small community spread out across big land. And my grandmother spent time in a boarding school, and my family has roots in the Indian Adoption Project of the 1960s. And so the idea that I would sort of sit at the head of a county's out-of-home placement team feels so contradictory to my existence. And as I mentioned earlier, I've been the most disappointed by professionals whose entire role and responsibility is to work in service to others. And so to loop back to Rachel's point about find the helpers in your community, I find it really fulfilling to sort of grind every day and work on that individual interventionist level. I think those small W's help you feel sustainable. And there's this piece of having your eyes on what's going on in the institution. that in the one hand can feel really grating and rubbing, and at the other hand is your eyes are open. So I think it's, it's individual choice. And for me, working in the institution feels like the right place, at least for now. Yeah, thank you for asking. Mm-hmm. And I think with that, we have time for one more question, President Rivera. So I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Great. So I'm going to ask the same question of all three of you, actually, Professor Dawes and Rachel and Kayla. And so they'll have to be a little bit brief, but I really want to hear it from all three of you. With all the things going on that we've already talked about tonight that may make us feel discouraged right now, that may cause us to feel despair, can you talk about just one thing that's giving you hope right now in terms of advancing human rights? Let's start with you, Professor Dawes.
Oh, hope. I'm very anti-hope. I tend to live as a hopeless person deliberately. I think hope that you can change the world often sets you up for failure, false expectations. And young people that I teach especially, it leads to burnout and just quitting. And so I prefer to cultivate instead an attitude that you're most always going to fail and that justice is going to lose. But that you get up, as you said, you get up and you grind and you do the work anyway because you're committed to embodying your values in the world. And while you may never see your ideal outcome achieved, you may prevent some of the very worst things from happening. So hope questions that I don't do so well with. Maybe they can do better.
Well, we might argue about the definition of hope. I feel like that's a really hopeful answer. I mean, for any of us to be planting trees under whose shade we may never enjoy feels like an essentially hopeful kind of an urge. But I take your point. Kayla, what do you think? Is anything giving you hope right now?
Yes, you mentioned earlier, on a very local level that the after is coming with the spread of the accessibility of the vaccination. But I think in general, I think in general, hope is something that is fulfilled for me on a daily basis because the actual act of work is fulfilling. And so I think I'm really committed to process and oriented to process versus outcome. Maybe that's similar to what Professor Dawes was saying. I also think about the last year and the way that it's been so revealing. For me, a lot of times the result of oppression is that the sense of possibility of the world feels very flat. Mm-hmm. And when things have been stripped down and there's a revealing, I think that there's also a sense of possibility because we know what we're looking at. And so again, for me, it's the daily grind. It's trudging forward. That's hopeful.
Great. And Rachel, you'll get the last opportunity to answer this one.
Get the last
What's
word.
giving you hope right now?
I really love what you said, Kayla, about possibility, because I've been thinking about that too. Because, in the wake of everything that's been burnt down with the pandemic and Black Lives Matter, figuratively and literally, there's open ground now to plant something new, to build something new. And I think I don't know if this is overly optimistic, but I do feel like decision makers, because I'm at a public policy school that is training supposedly future decision makers. And I've felt throughout the course of my education, I guess kind of, I've been moving away of this idea of decision makers as the person who is going to really make the difference. I already gave my plug for community organizing. Because decision makers are trained, at least at my school, I've realized that we are being trained to analyze and decide what is feasible. And that, I think, is the opposite of thinking about what's possible. So I think that it's the role of everyday people to shift the line on, to bring up possibilities and to shift the line on what decision makers think is feasible. And I think that is happening. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but I do think that this is a moment. If it doesn't happen now, when will it happen? In a worse catastrophe, I suppose. But I'm hopeful for the coming years.
That's great. Thank you, Rachel Rostad. Thank you, Kayla Richards. And thank you, Professor Dawes.
Thank you.
I also want to thank all the people in our audience who asked such insightful questions tonight. That was really, we talked through a lot of heavy topics, and we each brought different disciplinary training and different personal perspectives to the conversation, which is great. I mean, that engaging in this kind of way to increase understanding, I think we could all use more of that. So I thank all of you for participating in that. I think a giant step forward is going to be when these kinds of conversations are happening, not only on a stage like this, but in communities all around the country and all around the world. So the fact that we had this conversation is giving me hope today. Before we move to the networking portion of the event, I'm honored to first introduce Dan Ettinger, who's from the MAC class of 2004. Dan is a director of business development at Give Campus, and he's going to share his McAllister story with us in a minute. After Dan's words, I'm looking forward to the networking portion of the evening where we're going to hop into some Zoom breakout rooms and talk with each other. So with that, I'm going to invite Dan to join us now. Dan, are you ready?
I am.
Welcome.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dan Ettinger, he, him pronouns, class of 2004, and a proud volunteer as a McAllister Fund class agent. It's events like this that remind me just how proud I am to be a McAllister alumnus. I think a big part of that pride comes from a feeling that McAllister alumni are a bit different. And if I'm being honest, most of us are also a bit weird. And I mean that in the absolute very best of ways. McAllister grads stand out. We speak up and don't accept the status quo. We've been taught to be skeptical, to ask tough questions, to value diverse perspectives, and to be accountable for our actions. We disproportionately pursue careers in education, nonprofit, and government. We're more frequently interested in building a better world and not just a bigger house. When I worked as a student caller for the McAllister Fund, I remember hearing an alum telling me that a graduating class from the 60s decided that in lieu of a commencement speaker, to instead have a laser light show. Now, I have no idea if that's actually true, but it's certainly believable. By the same token, it was also totally believable that the first college president to stand up and publicly criticize the Muslim ban was McAllister's president. It was also believable that more recently, McAllister became one of the few top schools to make standardized testing optional as part of a larger strategy to increase the accessibility and equitability of a McAllister education. All of this makes us different, and it's what inspires me to stay connected to MAC. Now, when I was asked tonight why I choose to give back to McAllister, I decided that I give for two reasons. One, the symbolism, and two, the collective impact. I give for the symbolism in that giving to McAllister is my way of demonstrating that I appreciated my experience, that I recognize the financial burden students and families are facing, and I want to make McAllister more accessible. That I value McAllister's commitment to meeting the full financial need of every student that's admitted. That I think McAllister helps equip its alumni to make the world a better place, and that the world is a better place because of McAllister alumni. And that the COVID-19 pandemic and the racial injustice crisis have magnified just how much we need more thoughtful McAllister alumni in the world right now. Now, I also give because of the collective impact my gift can make. I recognize that, like most MAC alumni, I don't have deep enough pockets for my gift on its own to have a transformative impact. That said, nor will a single vote or call to an elected official, or one more attendee at a protest, or one less pound of greenhouse gas. And yet we take these actions because of their collective impact. And it's that sense of collective impact that makes me excited about McAllister's annual Give to McAllister Day, which is now just 3 weeks away. On Wednesday, April 14th, Give to McAllister Day is our opportunity to rally together as a community to help support the school and its students. It's not about how much money alumni can give, but much more about how many alumni give. It's the one day when all parts of the MAC community celebrate, connect, and support one another in the place that ties us all together. So when you get emails in April, and I'm sure you're going to get a few about Give to McAllister Day, I hope you'll join me in giving a gift of any size and show your support. In the meantime, watch out for a follow-up email from tonight's event with more ways you can stay engaged with Macalester, including more events like this one tonight. And with that, I'd like to close today's Big Questions event with a Macalester tradition, the offering the peace prayer by our current students. This tradition is a beautiful illustration of the values we hold dear. Thank you again, and go Matt.
เมื่อเฮาเริ่มออกเดินทางไปคนละสายขอให้พวกเฮาถูกหล่อเลี้ยงด้วยมิตรภาพและการเรียนรู้ที่แสนยาวนานขอให้เฮาใช้สิ่งเหล่านั้นสร้างโลกที่มีความยุติธรรมและสงบสุขยิ่งขึ้นโลกที่เต็มไปด้วยมิตรสหายและญาติพี่น้องความเคารพและเมตตาซึ่งกันและกันและความหวังเพื่ออนาคตที่ดีกว่าเก่า
अब हामी आफ्नो जिन्दगीको नयाँ यात्रामा अघि बढ्दा हाम्रो वर्षौंदेखिको मित्रता र शिक्षाबाट हामी सिन्चित हुन सकौं र यसलाई आधार बनाई अझै न्यायपूर्ण र शान्तिमय सद्भाव र सम्बन्धले गाँसिएको र एक अर्काप्रति आदर र करुणा गर्ने उज्जवल भविष्यको संसार सृजना गर्न सकौं.
As we depart along our separate roads, may we be nourished by our years of friendship and learning, and may we draw upon them to create a more just and peaceful world, a world filled with fellowship and kinship, with respect and kindness for one another, and with the hope of a better tomorrow.
Thank you again for joining this evening. We hope you will continue the conversation and networking in our Zoom room. Follow the link posted in the chat or from your confirmation email to join the Zoom networking meeting room. We will have breakout rooms to allow participants to meet in smaller groups and with our speakers. Once you join, you will be able to choose the breakout room of your choice. Please remember to turn your camera and mic on. The rooms will remain open until 8:45 p.m.